Thanks for watching. My name's Glen Morgan, and welcome to We the Govern. Now, why are Democrats pushing to basically double rents every 9 years in Washington state? Let's talk about the rent control bill that the Democrats are still debating in Olympia. So, we're actually coming up to the last few weeks of Washington state's legislative session in 2024. And this is actually a short session, like all election years, because after all, the politicians, they need to get back home and they need to fundraise and campaign to get reelected. So they're in a genuine rush to get out of Olympia, which is probably good for us. Now, many of the worst bills have already failed this legislative session, which is fortunate for the people who live here. And in many cases, the Republicans, they really do get some of the credit for opposing the crazy ideas that are ginned up every year by the lefties and crazies, who unfortunately occupy far too many seats in the Washington state legislature right now. However, not every bad bill has died, and one of the worst ones is still floundering around with virtue-signaling Democrats claiming to champion the idea. And in this case, we're talking about the latest rent control scheme being pushed by Democrats, once again. Now, rent control as legislation has actually been around America for over 100 years. Many cities and counties have gone down the yellow brick road of rent control as a public policy, and they've suffered the consequences. Of course, the people who live there are the ones who suffer. However, just like socialism, when it fails to produce the nirvana that's always promised, the supporters of these failed ideas just simply repackage the scheme and bring it back with different lipstick, and they claim that this time will be very different. Now, the Washington state Democrats and their kind of lefty friends, they're pushing rent control. But in order to put lipstick on this pig, they changed the name and they call it rent stabilization. Now, of course, like all dumb ideas, this one's based on the recognition that rent is too high, which is true, particularly in the Seattle area. And they're very right that rent is too high. However, one of the prime reasons rent is too high is because of the insane and very destructive policies always pushed by the exact same clowns who are now pretending to present their own solution to the problem that they've created as a feature of their public policy. Not a bug, it's been a feature. So recently, the Democrats in the state legislature, they approved a rent control bill that's in the lower house that would actually cap rental increases to 7% per year. Now, that sounds good, except to the math-challenged Democrats. Nobody really seems to realize that at this rate of rental increase, the rent will actually double for those renters every 9 years or so. And this is going to happen to most tenants in Washington state under this policy. The predictable problem that this dumb idea actually produces is that it incentivizes basically all landlords, whoever's left anyway, to jack up their rent, because it's a use it before you lose it mentality, by 7% every year. And this law actually encourages this result. Since bills like this, one, basically require both math illiteracy and historical ignorance in order to exist as public policy, this game has kind of become a prime piece of must-pass legislation for the Democrat Party this year. Now, like usual, they will continue to champion the policies that directly lead to just insane rental costs, the Growth Management Act, extortionate permit fees that for the central planners to then squander, and then pointless grifting costs that are imposed on property to make it far, far more expensive, which in turn just gets passed on to the renters. Then, of course, they'll introduce policies like the city of Seattle's done, which make it very difficult to rent your property to anyone, which is why so many small landlords are getting out of the business. So you're losing supply. And then, of course, the same politicians, they import as many drug addicts as possible to sleep on the streets and the parks. And then they take property off the rental market and they let those homeless drug addicts turn them into meth labs so nobody else can rent them. And now, of course, the same politicians are complaining about the predictable and certain outcome of a shortage of rental properties and the inevitable fact that rent is just too high. Now that they've kind of created this obvious and very well documented and very, very predictable crisis, enter the false claim that all they need is rent control, or as it's euphemistically called right now, rent stabilization. So here's what is certain. Guaranteed to happen. If they convince the state Senate to approve this bill, because it already came out of the House, so it's in the Senate, rents are going to double in 9 years for pretty much all those silly people who are renters in particular who think that politicians are coming to save them. Not that any Democrat in the state is going to care. Of course, there is one notable exception. I think I have to tell you about this. And that is actually State Senator Annette Cleveland, who, with stunning and unusual bravery, has actually refused to support this scheme. And she killed a similar version in the state Senate earlier this year, because there were two different bills that had started. So this Vancouver senator from the 49th Legislative District, usually she just swims downstream with the rest of the school of political fish. But in this legislature, on this policy issue, she actually has made the mistake of actually studying the policy and understanding the certain failures and harm it represents. So for this bravery and willingness to become educated on the subject, she's been scorched by the leftist crew at The Stranger, which is a Seattle newspaper, very similar to the Seattle Times, but with profanity tossed in their articles for emphasis about how cool socialism really can be. Now, since there are few Democrats left in the Washington State Legislature, really in either house, who are believers that math actually exists, Senator Cleveland stands out in her opposition. And the remaining Democrat math believer in the Senate, who's Senator Mark Mullet, currently running for governor, who actually appears to also be in opposition to this insanity, it really looks like, even with this dumb idea that has some challenges getting out of the state legislature this cycle, we'll still see. Now, the Democrats are struggling with this idea, even when they control every single level of power. I mean, they control it all. And that struggle is due in part now to the last few independent thinkers that they have yet to purge from their midst. So if this bad idea passes and the rents start escalating upwards, as they always do, it won't matter if we tell them that we warned them. Nobody will remember or even care. They will just laugh and shrug at the harm that they've inflicted on those who foolishly cast their votes for them this year. Now, by the way, as the legislative session kind of whimpers to its final few weeks, the floundering around and gnashing of teeth by the Democrats who are in control is actually kind of fascinating to observe. The Republicans have actually been unusually united in opposition to most of the worst of the bills that were proposed. Many of the bad proposals that we started the year out with have died, or they've failed, or they've just been watered down so much that they barely resemble their original concept. But looming over everything, of course, are the 6 initiatives, and it really looks like the impact of those initiatives have distracted many of the Dems from finagling many of their signature pieces of virtue signaling legislation, which is really why they're relegated to silly debates about 100-year-old failed concepts like rent control as their final math-denying masterpiece for the 2024 legislative session. Now, for all those lefties out there who genuinely believe this is good public policy, don't complain to me when your rent continues to rise. And if this bill passes, your rent will double every 9 years moving forward. Look in the mirror and at the clowns that you've elected. These guys are only going to make it far, far worse for you. And here's a little secret, not one of them really cares that they are hurting you, provided they can actually harvest your mail-in ballot or succeed in kind of surviving this next election cycle. That's all they care about. Now, to be fair, I have to give credit where credit's due. Senator Annette Cleveland has actually been very brave in attempting to swim upstream and properly recognize the failure of this foolish public policy. Now listen, I'm generally no fan of Senator Cleveland's. I mean, you can actually see here the Public Disclosure Commission complaint and the Citizens Action Notice litigation that I actually filed against her back in 2017. I mean, it's this case right here. I'll link to it down below. And I'm sure she's no fan of mine either, basically because of that. But to be fair, I need to call out her brave stance in opposing this stupid policy idea. I don't know if she can kill this bill in the Senate, but her opposition certainly has drawn the attention that this bad public policy deserves. And it doesn't matter if she likes me or not. That doesn't really matter. I believe it is important, though, to recognize somebody, particularly a Democrat, when they admit that math is real and virtue signaling public policy proposals that actually hurt the people are bad. It's basically a very rare act of bravery, and it really does deserve some recognition. So there are some other dumb and bad ideas that still have survived this legislative session. And I'll probably address more of these in the near future, but the drama around this rent control bill, it seems like it's really worth discussing right now. Now, I'm going to close this video with my usual statement. If you want to make a difference, you have to be somebody who's willing to stand up to the powers that be. You must be willing to engage and do the hard thing, just like Senator Cleveland has done. You can't make a difference or have an impact if you're not willing to do this sometimes. Because in the end, the future always and only belongs to those who show up. So continue to engage and show up out there.